Welcome to Words to Live By, a podcast series hosted by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Each week, we will share some of the wit and wisdom of Ronald Reagan. In essence, words to live by, made up of radio addresses and speeches he delivered from the 1960s through the 1980s. The subject of today's podcast is inflation. Yes, just like the song, everything old is new again. What we're going to hear today are two commentaries by Ronald Reagan, delivered almost 20 years apart. First is a radio address he delivered on inflation in 1975. And in the second half of the podcast, we'll hear the president report directly after leaving Washington on how he handled the problem of inflation. To put things in perspective, let's look at the world in the 70s. At home, Americans suffered through factory closures, high energy prices, gas lines, and a 10-year battle with inflation. In 1979, the Soviet Union brutally invaded Afghanistan, and Iranian radicals took 66 Americans hostage. On top of the political turmoil of the decade, Americans suffered from a stagnant economy and high inflation at the same time. This stagflation made homes, food, energy, and other goods steadily more expensive as jobs disappeared. Here's candidate Reagan's analysis from 1980.
Let it show on the record that when the American people cried out for economic help, Jimmy Carter took refuge behind a dictionary. Well, if it's a definition he wants, I'll give him one. A recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose yours. And recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his.
At the time, as one measure of the economy, an economist created the misery index, the unemployment rate, and inflation rate combined. During the 1970s, the index more than doubled to its highest point ever, almost 22%. Many Americans began to lose faith in the American dream. So, in his debate with Jimmy Carter, Governor Reagan asked the question,
"Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago?"
So, now, let's go back 5 years to listen to the following radio address written in January 1975. This was the first policy address Reagan wrote for the radio series, and he explores the relation between high prices and government regulations. Let's listen.
Inflation is high prices. Anything that lowers prices legitimately without hurting someone helps reduce inflation. Right now, business in America is more regulated by government than it is in any other country in the world where free enterprise is still permitted. If we had fewer regulations, we could have lower prices. Small businessmen, those with fewer than 500 employees, spend an estimated 130 million man-hours a year doing government-required paperwork. This adds about $50 billion a year to the cost of doing business, and that's added to the cost of the things you buy. Then government spends about 15 to 20 billion finding places to store all that paper, and you pick up the tab for that too, in your taxes. Government's grown so big in the last 4 decades that not even the Office of Management and Budget in Washington knows how many boards, agencies, bureaus, and commissions there are. But all of them have the power to adopt regulations with the authority of law. As a matter of fact, in a way, they have more power. If you're charged with breaking a law, you have your day in court, and you're considered innocent unless and until you're proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But breaking a regulation is another matter. The agency enforcing that regulation is judge, jury, and executioner, and you're guilty as charged unless you can prove your innocence. One small businessman in California ran afoul of one of those regulations. He was ordered to install separate men's and women's washrooms for his employees. He only has one employee, and at home they sleep in the same bed and use the same bathroom. She's his wife. In Connecticut, a chemical researcher has 5 employees. He files 37 different reports for 12 federal agencies. 26 sets of data for 9 state agencies, 25 for city departments, and now he's just learned he has to make out an environmental impact statement, probably telling why he uses so much paper. A druggist in another state reports it takes more time to do the paperwork in connection with a prescription than it does to make up the prescription. Speaking of drugs and paperwork, a few years ago a leading drug firm had to submit some 70 pages of data to the Federal Drug Administration to get a drug licensed. Recently, the same firm made application for a new drug and sent a truck loaded with 72,000 pages of data to support its application. If penicillin were discovered today, I doubt that it could get approval. The story's the same for every kind of business. We pay higher and higher prices because government continues to spend more than it takes in, and because too much money is chasing too few goods and services. There could be more available for us to buy if government would lift some of the paper burden from the back of our industrial system. Just a 3% reduction would also save about $12 billion a year in government costs. And wouldn't that be a refreshing way to slow down inflation? This is Ronald Reagan. Thanks for listening.
More about inflation and how the president viewed his policies in 1988 right after this brief message.
The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation is the nonprofit organization created by President Reagan himself, and specifically charged by him with continuing his legacy and sharing his principles: individual liberty, economic opportunity, global democracy, and national pride. We must remain vigilant and work together to share these conservative principles with younger generations. Your role is critical to move our mission forward. Thank you for your continued support. Please visit reaganfoundation.org/give. That's reaganfoundation.org/give.
Now, back to the story. They say if you don't have a plan, then you plan to fail. So with that in mind, did our president have a plan? Well, let's hear from him.
I had come to Washington with my mind set on a program, and I was anxious to get started on it. I don't know what I expected, but my first morning in the Oval Office had a surprising sense of familiarity. It reminded me a lot of my job as governor. On my desk was a schedule of appointments for the day. There were meetings with the cabinet, staff, and legislators, and outside my door were Ed Meese, Mike Deaver, and others who'd been with me in Sacramento. There was another similarity. Just as I'd come to Sacramento when the state was facing its worst financial crisis in decades, the country was experiencing what many economists called its greatest economic emergency since the Great Depression. The most immediate priority was dealing with double-digit inflation, high unemployment, and a prime interest rate of 21.5%, the highest since the Civil War. As I've said, I believe that policies of the federal government reaching back decades were mostly responsible for the problems. Although I knew we couldn't turn things around overnight, I wanted to begin reversing those mistakes, and now I had a chance to try to do it. With my advisors, I had begun working on an economic recovery plan the first day after the election. The morning after Inauguration Day, at our first cabinet meeting, and a meeting the following day of a team of specialists I had appointed to coordinate economic policy, we began the job of implementing the plan. Its basis was tax reform, reducing federal income tax rates from top to bottom. Simply put, I believed that if we cut tax rates and reduced the proportion of our national wealth that was taken by Washington, the economy would receive a stimulus that would bring down inflation, unemployment, and interest rates. And there would be such an expansion of economic activity that in the end, there would be a net increase in the amount of revenue to finance the important functions of government. Excessive tax rates were at the heart of the problem. Back in the 14th century, a Muslim philosopher named Khaldun wrote something about taxes in ancient Egypt. At the beginning of the dynasty, taxation yields a large revenue from small assessments. At the end of the dynasty, taxation yields a small revenue from large assessments. In other words, when rates were low, the revenue was great. When rates were high, the revenue was low.
Recall that the president majored in economics at Eureka College, so this subject was of great interest to him. Let's continue hearing from a supply-sider.
During the 1980 campaign, a new term, supply-side economics, came into vogue. People said I embraced this theory, and several economists claimed credit for inventing its principles, which I then adopted as the basis for my economic recovery program. Well, to set the record straight, that wasn't true. At Eureka College, my major was economics, but I think my own experience with our tax laws in Hollywood probably taught me more about practical economic theory than I ever learned in a classroom or from an economist, and my views on tax reform did not spring from what people called supply-side economics. When the IRS took as much as 94% of my earnings when I was in Hollywood, after a while I began asking myself whether it was worth it to take another job. Something was wrong with a system like that. When you have to give up such a large percentage of your income in taxes, incentive to work goes down. You don't say, I've got to do more pictures. You say, I'm not going to work for 6 cents on the dollar. If I decided to do one less picture, that meant other people at the studio in lower tax brackets wouldn't work as much either. The effect filtered down, and there were fewer total jobs available. The same principle that affected my thinking applied to people in all tax brackets. The more government takes in taxes, the less incentive people have to work. What coal miner or assembly line worker jumps at the offer of overtime when he knows Uncle Sam is going to take 60% or more of his extra pay? And the principle applies as well to corporations and small businesses. When government confiscates half or more of their profits, the motivation to maximize their profits goes down, and their owners and managers make decisions based partly on a desire to avoid taxes. They begin looking for tax shelters and loopholes that contribute nothing to the growth of our economy. Their companies don't grow as fast. They invest less in new plants and equipment and hire fewer people. Any system that penalizes success and accomplishment is wrong. Any system that discourages work, discourages productivity, discourages economic progress is wrong. If, on the other hand, you reduce tax rates and allow people to spend or save more of what they earn, they'll be more industrious, they'll have more incentive to work hard, and money they earn will add fuel to the great economic machine that energizes our national progress. The result? More prosperity for all and more revenue for government. A few economists call this principle supply-side economics. I just call it common sense. I've always thought of government as a kind of organism with an insatiable appetite for money that will grow forever unless you do something to starve it. By cutting taxes, I wanted not only to stimulate the economy, but curb the growth of government and reduce its intrusion into the economic life of the country. But I knew we faced a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives that had a much different view than I did about cutting the tax rates and reducing the role of government.
Now we get to the heart of the issue: how to get the plan through Congress.
A few days after the inauguration, I invited Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, over to see me in the White House. He was full of Irish warmth, a great storyteller, and I liked him. But it was evident he had come to the Oval Office to set me straight on how things operated in Washington. "You're in the big leagues now," he said. Well, I felt that spending 8 years as governor of one of the largest states in the country wasn't exactly the minor leagues. I told him I thought I'd been in the big leagues for quite a while. We agreed that since we were going to have to do business with each other, we should try our best to get along. Still, Tip didn't try to hide the fact that he thought I had come to Washington to dismantle everything he believed in, things he and other liberals had spent decades fighting for, starting with the New Deal. As far as he was concerned, I was the enemy. I guess from his point of view, he was right. In Sacramento, the most important lesson I'd learned was the value of going around the legislature and taking my case directly to the people. As president, I intended to do the same thing. It had worked in Sacramento, and I thought it would work in Washington. In early February, I told the people that solving problems which had accumulated over decades would take time, but all of us working together could do it. I said we must realize there is no quick fix. But we cannot delay in implementing an economic program aimed at both reducing tax rates to stimulate productivity and reducing the growth in government spending to reduce unemployment and inflation. I sent Congress a bill calling for an across-the-board 30% tax cut over 3 years. Meanwhile, we launched a program under Vice President Bush to reduce unnecessary government regulation of the economy. After the broadcast, Tip O'Neill and other tax and spenders in Congress let out a howl, and I knew we were in for a battle. A few days later, we unveiled a plan to cut billions of federal expenditures by eliminating needless boards, agencies, and programs. A start at reducing the $80 billion budget deficit the federal government faced that year. The Democrats let out another howl and proposed drastic cuts in defense spending, while I was determined to increase military spending to reverse the effects of years of neglect of our armed services. Leaders at the Pentagon had told me appalling stories of how the Soviets were gaining on us militarily, both in nuclear and conventional forces. They were spending 50% more each year on weapons than we were. Meanwhile, in our armed forces, the paychecks were so small that some married enlisted men and women were eligible for welfare benefits. Many military personnel were so ashamed of being in the service that as soon as they left their posts, they put on civilian clothes. I told the Joint Chiefs of Staff I wanted to do whatever it took to make our men and women proud to wear their uniforms again, and I asked them to tell me what new weapons they needed to achieve military superiority over our potential enemies. I knew reversing the effects of years of neglect would be expensive and difficult, but during the campaign, the people of America told me nothing mattered more to them than national security. Time and again, when I went around the country calling for a balanced budget, I'd get this question: what if it comes down to a choice between national security and the deficit? Every time I answered, I'd have to come down on the side of national defense, and every time I did, the audience roared. Nobody wanted a second-class Army, Navy, or Air Force defending our country. A number of things that happened during my watch as president gave me great satisfaction, but I'm probably proudest about the economy. In 1981, no problem the country faced was more serious than our nation's economic crisis. Not even the need to modernize our armed forces, because without a recovery, we couldn't afford to do the things necessary to make the country strong again or lessen the threat of nuclear war. Nor could America regain confidence in itself and stand tall again. Nothing was possible unless we made the economy sound again. In July 1981, Congress approved much of the plan I'd brought to Washington to deal with the economic emergency our country faced. But only after I'd gone to the people to ask their help, to ask them to make their views known to Congress. I had to compromise and accept a 25% reduction over 3 years instead of the 30% I wanted. But it provided the jolt needed to turn around our economy. The economic expansion that began a year after the first phase of the tax cuts went into effect created more than 19 million new jobs, the largest increase for a comparable period of time in history. Meanwhile, the percentage of Americans employed at good jobs rose to an all-time high. As I write this, the expansion is in its 92nd month and still going strong. The 25% tax cut, followed by tax reform in 1986, touched off a surge of growth in America that brought down inflation, brought down interest rates, brought down unemployment, and created a cascade of additional tax revenue for government. Realizing they could keep more of what they earned, people went out and made more money. They used this money to buy more houses, more furniture, more appliances, more cars. Corporate as well as personal taxes were simplified and reduced to the lowest rate since 1941. Businesses began investing more in plants and equipment, making their workers more competitive. And instead of throwing money into wasteful shelters and tax dodges, individuals and businesses began investing it in productive enterprises that created growth and more new jobs. Although it didn't bring as much simplification to the tax code as I had hoped, the Tax Reform Act of 1986 reduced the number of personal income tax brackets from 14 to 3. and the top personal tax bracket, which was 70% in 1981, for most Americans to 28%, the lowest rate since 1931. Knowing they could now keep 70% of what they earned instead of paying 70% to the government, the most affluent Americans invested in new projects and new ideas. But contrary to what some of the tax and spend liberals have said, tax reform didn't create a windfall for the rich at the expense of the poor. Instead, it was the other way around. Under the new laws, more than 80% of Americans paid the lowest tax rate, 15%, or no tax at all, and the households of 4 million lower-income working Americans were excused from paying federal income taxes altogether. Presidents can propose a budget, lobby to get it passed, and do their best to make sure that government agencies under their control within the executive branch don't waste the money appropriated by Congress. They can veto spending bills passed by Congress. But under our system of separation of powers, it is Congress that determines the programs government finances and how much money is appropriated for each of them. I don't think we'll solve the problem of the deficit until 3 things happen. First, we need more discipline on spending in Congress. We need a constitutional amendment requiring it to balance the budget, and we need to give our presidents a line-item veto.
Thank you for listening. For more information on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, including information on how to become a member, information on upcoming exhibits at the Reagan Library, and more information on the legacy of President Reagan, please visit reaganfoundation.org. And don't forget to like and follow the Reagan Foundation on all social media platforms.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Words to Live By podcast in your iTunes or Google Play stores and on other podcast platforms as they become available. New episodes of Words to Live By come out every Tuesday. Like what you hear? Check out our A Reagan Forum podcast featuring great speeches delivered at the Reagan Library. New episodes drop every Thursday. And don't forget to follow @Ronald Reagan on Facebook, @Ronald Reagan 40 on Twitter, and Reagan Foundation on YouTube. Also, search for us on SoundCloud and Stitcher.